much for the kind invitation to chair this conference here, the Research Association for Interdisciplinary Studies, here at Princeton at the Erdman Center, at the beautiful campus. And I do thank the RACE team that has made this possible. I thank the audience for being here today with us. And above all, thank you very much for the kind award that was given to me. My today's contribution for the 10th RACE conference here at Princeton is Capitalism Crowding Out Fertility. So this paper speaks about fertility rates and the relation of fertility rates with capitalism. And first I introduce alternative capitalism theories and show that that fertility is a driver of over and under reproduction, and overpopulation and under reproduction. The existing literature has a vast array of crowding out factors influencing fertility around the globe, featuring hardly any reference to economic variables. So we hear a lot about psychological factors. There is a lot of literature on family constellation, on critical life moments, life events, on matching partner, spouse, fertility, health, reproduction, governmental influence, but there's hardly anything out, or I didn't see anything on economic variables really driving fertility rates. And then I make the argument that it may be capitalism and access to markets that draws attention of people, and the attention of production and consumption curbs people's human imbued wish for parenthood. What is a very strongly reported effect in the literature is that education has a negative impact on fertility rates. So once you give female education, once they obtain higher education, they become less interested in procreation. They push the age and they have less children. And then I make the argument that it may not be simply education, it may be education obtained by female in anticipation that they will compete in a market, and they need to be fitter to compete in a market, and that's why they obtain education. And market economies thereby potentially bleed into societies in this anticipation of having to compete and obtaining higher education, which drives down the fertility rates. So now I've made the theoretical argument, and then I try to back it up with different data sets. First, a 180 country strong worldwide data set of the 2017 Economic Freedom Index, which is comprised of property rights protection, judicial effectiveness, governmental integrity, fiscal health, freedoms of business, labor, monetary policy, trade, investment, finance, taxation, GDP freedoms, and foreign direct investment inflows. All these factors that are making up the Economic Freedom Index are negatively correlated with fertility rates. And what is positively related to fertility is tariffs and taxation, which are usually seen as curbing factors, or factors that curb capitalism. So tariffs and taxation are associated with higher fertility rates. Industrialization and rural access is the next part that I looked into. When you look into market economies, there's something like the UNIDO has 139 countries strong worldwide data set on industrialization intensity, and that speaks about how much industrialized your country is. And this industrialization intensity index for the year 2014 and fertility rates are negatively correlated. So the more industrialized your country, the less likely, or the lower the fertility rate. And then there's a lot of literature on rural, the divide between rural areas and metropolitan areas, and usually it is said that in metropolitan areas capitalism blooms and economic productivity is higher than in rural areas. But usually innovation doesn't happen on a farm, and so I took this rural access index for 64 countries around the world, which speaks about how much rural access your country has. And I show here again higher fertility rates in the more rural areas and lower fertility rates in the more metropolitan countries of the world. Next data set, 50 US states. We have the 2017 Economic Freedom Index as well, and here I find again the more economic, the more productive your US state. For instance, New York is the top economic freedom index state. The lower the fertility rate. And everyone who lives in Manhattan knows what I'm speaking about is not the place where you raise your children. Usually once people get children in Manhattan, they start moving out to other states. And then the third idea was to show it also, so this was always cross-sectional, but then the next idea was to show it over time. And we have this beautiful political example of historical examples of communism imploding, giving way to markets rolling in a fast pace, and also Islamic regimes that went through war or through different periods where they had more of a westernization, a change in the regime, in the government, and more Western values starting to ingrain into society, and with that coming our markets rolling in. And here you can also, over time, you can read out what's going on with education. Is it really education that's driving the effect, or is it markets that roll in? So the first example for communism, the heart of the former communist countries, the Russian Federation fertility rate in birth per women, you see on the left-hand side. And here you see once communism starts imploding in the end 1980s and then start in the beginning of the 1990s, fertility drops. And it goes up then higher. In the end, again, I heard from a friend that Russia was like really worried about this stark drop in fertility, and the government then started supporting, so curbing potentially or countervening this drop. But then you can read out what's going on with education. And here you see on the right-hand side the Russian gross enrollment ratio in tertiary education. You can see that once communism imploded and capitalism rolled in, we have education going down as well. So this is counter the example that I brought before, or the standard neoclassical literature that says education is crowding out fertility. It's not actually education, potentially. Here we see that fertility and education go down once market roll in. So if it were that education really is the driving factor, then education would need to go up, so fertility goes down, but here both go down. Second example for communism is the beautiful field experiment in Germany. After World War II, or from the 1950s on, there were two different parts, East and West Germany. We drew up the wall in Berlin. And we see here in the chart that starts at 1954, the West German line is blue, and the red line is East Germany. In the beginning, the fertility rates were pretty much the same, and then from the 1960s on, which is usually referred to as the post-World War II baby boomer miracle that we had, economic miracle in the Western European part. We see that East Germany stays high, but Germany starts or the West German part that has this economic miracle goes down, and then stays pretty much stable. And then once communism imploded in late 1980 and the beginning of 1990s, you see East Germany completely plummets. Fertility goes down, and on the right-hand side you have the chart for the number of pupils in the country. You see that also education went down. So you have, if it were education, education would need to go up, but education also went down. So we had education and fertility going down once markets rolled into East Germany, and there was more of a competitive vibe. The next example of communism, Czech Republic. Fertility rates go down once the Czech Republic opens up to free markets. The education goes up. Here is the only example where you have education going up and fertility going down. And then westernization, Islamic Iran, fertility rates in birth. There was this opening after the war, this link to the Western society, to markets, to Americanization. And this is actually the starkest drop in fertility ever reported in a country. Iran, once Westernization rolled in and free markets opened up, fertility went down. Unfortunately, we do not have too much data for tertiary education, but in terms of stringency, I added it here. But here, Iran, Westernization, markets roll in, fertility goes down. So make this both arguments that industrialization, globalization, and capitalism lead to vanishing populations, being potentially occupied by production and consumption, but also by the entertainment of capitalist markets. Economic mobility and international trade may distract societies to prosper regarding fertility. Focus on competing in markets may hinder from procreation. Equilibria in markets may have an undocumented negative effect on fertility. Unruled capitalism may lead to a falling rate of fertility, decimating the population and eventually also, in the end, the reserve pool of economic agents. The two conclusions that come out of this, that markets crowd out fertility. On the one hand, markets could potentially be used as a birth control mechanism in those parts of the world where overpopulation is a problem and demands for governments to find ways to lower the fertility rate. And there are countries in the world, I know the UN has it on the agenda, INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, it's a think tank that evolved out of George Soros, who was always a forethinker. Major institutions have it on the radar that overpopulation really creates misery these days in certain parts of the world. And in those, potentially, it's better to have capitalism rolling in rather than other governmental means. Or one argument, and I will make more in the next slide, is that international aid potentially has created the means that you feed more children for a while, so you have overpopulation, but then overpopulation creates social miseries because food is cheaper than the medical assistance, so you might grow your children a bit, but then they become sick and you don't have the means anymore to support them in terms of medical assistance. So the idea is here that international aid actually potentially has created problems of overpopulation, and I show more on this in data in a slide. So I don't argue against international aid, but potentially have international aid be also focused and targets on markets, maybe not only funding primary needs, but also funding innovation markets, schools, education, and develop long term. And the idea here is that that certain parts, we have seen decades of international aid going into parts of the world, and to this day we have not solved the problems there, but potentially have created a new problem of overpopulation, which then leads into migration, which then leads to social misery. Not migration leads to social misery, but overpopulation in a country can lead to social misery and migrating streams. And then, on the other hand, in those parts of the world where you have capitalist societies that are dying out, and there are countries that are dying out in the Western world and in the US, for instance, US is an example that I want to a bit leave aside because they are very much an immigration country, and immigrants are usually, so they make up for the shrinking American population, they make up with immigration, and migrants are usually younger, very productive, fertile people who are willing to have children and potentially are not so ingrained in markets, or the female are not so ingrained in markets because it's harder for them to get education that quickly or speed up on education. So in those markets, you should potentially curb capitalism and use the revenues by curbing capitalism, for instance, with taxation. Use those revenues in order to subsidize people to have children. And then I created this beautiful map on my homepage, www.juliamppuaschunder.com. I created this Socio-Econo-Engineering map where I show the red and orange areas are those areas. It's an interactive graph on my homepage. Fertility and Capitalism. So there potentially go in with taxation and then fund subsidize families and family values and have people have the financial means to afford to have children. So curb capitalism maybe through taxation, maybe via tariffs. But in those areas that are green and yellow, which are overpopulated, potentially roll in more capitalism and leave aside, I mean, to continue international aid, but peg international aid also to education and to economic prosperity. Those are the recommendations. So in the overpopulation, low capitalism versus underproduction, reproduction, high capitalism spectrum, infuse economic freedoms in birth control needed territories, but tax capitalist activities to fund parenthood via direct investments in social benefits for having children, or subsidize parenthood in order to alleviate the falling rate of fertility in the eye of capitalism. Wider implications of this: on the one hand, I also make the argument that you should potentially also breed the intergenerational glue. So in those areas that are dying out, you will see a problem of intergenerational glue if people have not children. And I bring a few examples what you can do in societies that are really dying out. So migration is one of them, or let immigrants in. Other overpopulation, other under reproduction areas are that you form communities that have intergenerational glue trainings. So you have more of you let aside the traditional families and have more of a larger communities, old meeting young. And then the second argument I bring in is innovative and a very futuristic prospect in the age of artificial intelligence. So the RACE conference also focuses a bit on artificial intelligence, and robotics and artificial intelligence slowly taking over human capital labor activities. So robots doing our work will potentially create a preciousness of everything that is innate in human beings. Humanness will become more valuable. And also, one of the things that is really innate in human beings, which has not been replicated by artificial intelligence or algorithms yet, is procreation. So it is the futuristic outlook and the hope that the age of artificial intelligence will potentially readjust pricing for humanness and human fertility, and in the end, that procreation and becoming pregnant and having children, bearing this beautiful gift, will become potentially also more precious in terms of market gratification. But this is a futuristic outlook, and thank you very much.